High Elves, Blood Elves, Void Elves, Sindorai, Queldorai, Keldorai. Do you know the differences between each? And what exactly is a High Elf and why is it being so fiercely requested? Hey guys, it's been a hotly debated topic for a few months now about whether the High Elves should be introduced into the Alliance as an allied race. It was a little confusing to me at first, so I decided to try and make my own case for them, and to let you guys decide whether or not you think High Elves should be offered. Be sure to let me know in the comments if you think there's strong enough reasons to let them be playable, or if they should be discarded as there are already way too many elves in WoW. Before we go into the for and against points, let's delve a little into their background so that we can get a better idea of where they stand. To start off, there are the Night Elves, the Keldorai, the very first elves in Warcraft that evolved from trolls. Then there are the Highborn, the Queldorai, an elite caste of Night Elves that were the favourites of Queen Azshara. From these Highborn, a sect of them, known as the High Elves, would split off and rebel against Azshara when she started to meddle with the Legion. These elves will be our main topic for this video. Blood Elves, the Sindorai, are the playable race we know of in the Horde today. They emerged following Arthur's and the Scourge destruction of Quel'Thalas, renaming themselves with the prefix Blood in order to always remember their kin that died for them. The last sect would be the Nightborn race we encounter in the Legion expansion, the Sheldorai. These are the original Night Elves of Suramar that managed to shield themselves from the outside world for 10,000 years, until we discover them in the Legion storyline. There are other groups of Night Elves, but these are the major ones. So now let's explore a little of High Elf background in order to make a case for them to join the Alliance. Following the sundering that occurred thousands of years ago, the Night Elves decided to adopt Druidism and outlawed the practice of arcane magics, with its use being punishable by death. Considering the effects of the sundering caused by Queen Azshara delving into arcane and fell magics in order to attract the Legion, such a measure was seen as acceptable to most of a Night Elf society. However, many Highborn that survived the sundering began to suffer the effects of magical withdrawal and spoke out against Malfurion and the Druids. Darth Remar Sunstrider, later to be the first leader of Quel'Thalas, resisted the Druids' law and continued to practice magic with his Highborn followers. The Night Elf Druids could not bring themselves to execute so many of their kin, and so instead decided to exile all the Highborn from their lands. The Highborn were happy to leave, free to practice their arcane magics as they wished. Eventually, they would set sail upon the seas and discover the Eastern Kingdoms, forming their own new magical realm. They abandoned the concepts of Elune and nocturnal activity, embracing the sun instead, becoming what would be known as the first independent High Elves. It is in the Eversong Woods that they would establish their first and last capital city, Quel'Thalas. From this point on, many High Elf actions would indicate very strong ties with the Alliance. Number 1. A long history with the Alliance. The strongest point of all would be that they have been close allies of the Alliance for thousands of years. 2,800 years before the very first war with the Orcs, the High Elves turned to the human kingdom of Azeroth for support when they were besieged by the Amani in the Troll Wars. The two formed a military alliance in exchange for the teaching of 100 humans in the ways of High Elven arcane magic. And thus, the first human mages were born, setting a strong precedent for future interactions between High Elf mages and human mages for thousands of years to come. High Elves and humans also battled together in the First and Second Wars against the Orcish Horde. In the First War, they sent a small force to aid the humans in their fight against the Orcs, and in the Second War, they provided many archers, rangers, and destroyers to the conflict, and even provided numerous craftsmen to help operate the lumber mills of the Alliance. While relations were rocky after the wars, with the High Elves largely abandoning the Alliance, a substantial number of them remained in Dalaran and remained loyal to the Alliance through the Kirin Tor. High Elven priests also stayed in Lordaeron, healing and restoring their wounded human comrades. Many of these priests also joined with Prince Arthas in investigating the Scourge Plague. After this would follow the tragedy and end of the High Elven Kingdom, with Arthas cutting through and decimating their entire city when he returned from Northrend as a Death Knight. We see this in Warcraft 3, where he taints the Sunwell in order to resurrect Kel'Thuzad and raises Sylvanas in the process as a Banshee. Their numbers then drastically dwindled, with the Scourge slaying over 90% of the population. Those that were in Lordaeron met a similar fate, and as Archimonde destroyed Dalaran, the second greatest concentration of High Elves perished as well. Following this would be the rise and fall of Prince Kael'thas, as with the Sunwell destroyed, he sought for a new source of magic to sate his people's thirst. His journeys would lead him all the way to Outland and allying with Illidan, but that's a tale for another day. In the end, the High Elves would never recover from the Scourge decimation. But in order to make a compelling argument, we can't just look at the past, and we must also determine whether High Elves fit in within the present day Alliance. So what is their relationship like with the other members of the Alliance today? First up would be of course the humans, the current leaders of the Alliance. As we've already explored, High Elves and humans have had a long history together. While their abandonment of the Alliance after the Second War left a bitter taste in the humans' mouths, they are still very accepting of High Elves into their cities. Many High Elves can be seen occupying the city of Stormwind and Theramore before its fall, with many High Elves stationed within the Theramore military. Additionally, Dalaran, the capital city of human mages, has granted the High Elves a safe haven within its walls after their exile from Quel'Thalas, reinforcing the strong historical ties between human and elven mages. Dalaran also serves as the home for the Silver Covenant, the most prominent group of High Elves, led by Verisa Windrunner, that we can see in the game that have sworn their allegiance to the Alliance, fervently taking part in multiple Alliance military offensives. So it can be pretty safe to say that the humans of the Alliance will be pretty welcoming towards the High Elves. Even though there might have been a slight road bump in their relationships in the past, with a leader like Anduin in charge, I have no doubt that he will be most accepting towards them. The next Alliance race on the list would be the Dwarves. Surprisingly, High Elves have had a very positive relationship with the Dwarves, especially the Wowhammer Dwarves. During the Scourge invasion, the High Elves had planned to evacuate their people to seek refuge with the Wowhammer Dwarves of the Hinterlands, even though the Elves had already formally left the Alliance. And not only do they share geographic proximity, with Quel'Daniel Lodge being hinterland neighbours with Aerie Peak, but they also share many cultural similarities, such as a love for nature and hatred of evil, so dwarves would have little problems with the High Elves. Next, we have gnomes. Although physically and culturally distinct, gnomes very much share the High Elves' natural affinity to magic. It was also well known that many gnomes and High Elves worked together closely in Dalaran before its destruction, particularly within the Council of Tirisfal. Next, we have the Draenei. While not much is indicative of their relationship, we see that Draenei are present at Quel'Daniel Lodge, residing within its grounds, so it's safe to say that these two races have at least positive relations with one another. Lastly, we come to the Night Elves. While High Elf relations with their Night Elf cousins have traditionally been poor due to a turbulent past, that is, due to the outlawing and exile of High Elves from Night Elf lands thousands of years ago, relations between the two seem to be thawing. While the Night Elves had initially warned and advised against allowing the High Elves into the Alliance, High Elves are now actually allowed within Darnassus, and Night Elf individuals have also been seen to join up with the Silver Covenant, the military wing of the High Elves. Not only that, but Verisa Windrunner attended Malfurion's and Tyrande's wedding together with her husband and half-elf sons, suggesting highly improved Night Elf-High Elf relations. If the leaders of the respective factions can attend each other's weddings, then I personally see no reason why diplomatic ties can't be a possibility. So those are the reasons why High Elves fit pretty well into the Alliance. But what about their views of the Horde? Well, from what we know, they really hate the races of the Horde. Apart from the Tauren, whom the Highborn have had some ancient historical contact, High Elves loathe the majority of Horde's races. Trolls almost wiped them out completely, both during the Troll Wars and the Second War. Orcs had been absolutely brutal to not only the humans but also the High Elves, slaughtering any in their way as they waged war through the Dark Portal. Not much needs to be said of the Forsaken, as not only are they seen as abominations by almost every other living race, but they also occupied Lordaeron, one of the main cities of High Elf residents. And lastly, the Blood Elves are just as hated by the High Elves. For one, the Blood Elves currently support the Horde, and this is seen by the remaining High Elves as a massive betrayal due to their historical ties with the members of the Alliance. Secondly, whatever High Elves remained after Arthas's rampage were banished from their home of Quel'Thalas, as Lothramar did not wish to rule a divided people. So not only did their cousins kick them out of their ancestral home, but they also joined up with the enemy. So, we know that the High Elves are already inherently aligned with the Alliance and hate the Horde. These are strong enough reasons backed up by tons of lore, but what other reasons might there be to justify their inclusion? Well, with Queen Azshara coming up as a main antagonist of BfA, it makes a lot of sense for High Elves to jump into the scene, as they were the first ones to fight against her methods. When Azshara began to summon in the Legion 10,000 years ago, the High Elves of Zin Ashari, the original capital city of the Night Elves, rebelled against her, helping to turn the tide and giving time for the Night Elves to emerge victorious from the battle. With her return, it only makes sense for the remaining High Elves to gather their forces and fight back against their common foe that led them down their tragic path in the first place. If she hadn't dabbled with the Legion, they would still be enjoying their glorious civilization as the elite of it, and so most definitely harbour resentment towards her. And so those are the three main lore reasons why High Elves make a lot of sense for an Alliance allied race. But what about non-lore reasons? Well, here are a few that also favour making the High Elves an allied race. Number 4. Visuals don't matter for faction distinction. One of the main arguments against the inclusion of High Elves would be they look too similar to Blood Elves, causing confusion. This is true, as the only difference lore-wise would be in their eye colour. However, certain counterpoints would make this concern moot. For one, the Pandaren have already proven that visual similarities are not considerable barriers in allowing both factions to have similar races. If Blizzard can do it for Pandaren, they can do it for Elves too. In addition, Blizzard has shown that it is well within their power to aesthetically distinguish similar yet distinct races, as we can see from the Nightborn and Night Elves. While difficult to tell apart, especially when clad full in armor, anyone can tell that they are also pretty different in many aspects. Lastly, PvP wise, this isn't too much of a concern, as any enemy would automatically be tagged in red colour. Number 5. There are too few High Elves left. The number of High Elves currently left is minute at best, with estimates ranging under 2,000 at least. However, existing population has never been a barrier to entry in whether a race can be a faction or allied race. Many examples exist, such as the new Void Elves, who number a few dozen at most, the Darkspear Trolls, who were almost wiped out multiple times, the Gnomes, who suffered a similar fate in Gnomeregan, and the Blightwater Goblins, the lucky few that managed to escape the destruction of Khazan. Numbers have never dictated a race's ability to join a faction, and some, like the Darkspear, have even risen to great prominence, for example in how Vol'jin was chosen to be a war chief. Number 6. Faction balance is a non-issue. Very few Horde players are going to head over to the Alliance just to switch from a Blood Elf to a High Elf, unless they are deeply invested into High Elf lore. We have not seen any mass exodus since the introduction of Void Elves, and so it's safe to assume that a similar introduction of Quel'Dorai should not cause faction imbalance issues. So with all that said and done, it seems that there are very strong reasons for High Elves to be suitable as an allied race for the Alliance. However, there is a pretty strong reason of why it might be unwise to request for High Elves as an allied race, and that is this. If High Elves are introduced, they will have to fill up a potential allied race slot for the Alliance, and the Horde will get an allied race in return. Imagine if the Horde get Valpera, and what the Alliance get in return are High Elves, or the Horde get Ogres, and the Alliance get High Elves. A very large part of the Alliance player base will call Horde biased and be extremely peeved. Why do the Horde get completely new races and the Alliance get some rehashed elves? Players that are primarily concerned about gameplay instead of lore will also be really put off to get a rehashed allied race, an allied race of sorts, instead of a brand new allied race. On that premise, with a substantial number of Alliance players spamming Blizzard's suggestion box for High Elves, I just have to say that we as a community have to be careful of what we ask for. Personally, if I had to make an ultimate choice between High Elves and Void Elves, I would choose High Elves in a heartbeat. But if we had to choose between High Elves and a completely new Alliance race when we already have Void Elves, unfortunately we can't turn back the clock, and Void Elves are here to stay. I think we all know that the vast majority will vote for a brand new race instead, even if it's with a bitter taste in our mouths. Perhaps it was a mistake on Blizzard's part to choose Void Elves over High Elves, but I will give them some leeway at this stage. They are, for the first time, dipping their toes into the territory of allied races. Perhaps they chose to go with Void Elves because they were suitable for the build-up into BfA and the main antagonist of the Void. Or perhaps they just chose to introduce them because they wanted to keep the High Elves out of the Alliance faction as a whole. But for whatever reasons, good or bad, they chose to go with Void Elves, and that's what we got. We can definitely voice our disappointment about it, but to ask for another rehashed allied race, which will have to take up the slot of an entirely brand new Alliance allied race, might not be the optimal choice at this point. Nevertheless, this is just my own opinion. Definitely let me know in the comments what you think and where you stand on this issue, and whether or not I may have missed out any key points for and against the inclusion of High Elves. Also, if you'd like to see more of such allied race content, be sure to hit that subscribe button. As always, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in Azeroth.